So I have created 6 action steps, and these are immediate action steps that we could take as a district to begin enacting some of these priorities. And these priorities will take time. This is going to be slow work, some of it, but I think we can begin taking steps immediately. Sometimes values inform actions, sometimes actions inform values. I think it's a little bit of both in this, and then once we start the work, I think the work will make more sense. I think we'll have more buy-in in the work. But I think all of this is work that we firmly believe in as a district, and I think our communities do as well. So the 6 action steps, I'll go through each of them individually, beginning with the first, which is creating rigorous, differentiated, standards-aligned benchmarks. So this is to go with the teaching and learning, the rigorous, ambitious instruction priority. The very first thing we need to do is to figure out where we're moving toward. As a state, we have not adopted any standards. We have not adopted Common Core standards. We have some standards, but as a state, we've not adopted them yet. But I think as a district, we need to make moves to actually either create them, to adopt Common Core, to adopt what has been proposed in Indiana. But we must have some kind of standard that we're moving toward and an understanding of what that looks like in terms of rigor. So I would argue for this, we need multiple points of entry for rigor. This cannot just be for students in higher tracks. This cannot just be for students at the schools that are magnet schools focused on IB instruction. This must be at all levels of our organization in each classroom. So ultimately this is differentiation, but also rigor must be accessible from all points. Secondly, to quote Elmore, task predicts performance. So we must have a focus on task if our goal is to actually affect the outcomes and to create rigorous instruction. If we simply create the same tasks but we make them more challenging potentially in terms of concepts or conceptual understanding, but the task is still a low-level task, students will not be engaged in rigorous instruction. This will not be ambitious, this will not be deeper learning. It will be the same task, but with material that they found on the internet probably, or from a classmate who understood, or from the teacher who provides the answer. Whatever it is, the rigor will not be present in that instruction. So we must have a focus on task. And I see this connecting very deeply to the work in my next action steps around teacher. Lastly, on this one, we need to focus on the instructional core, and this is very closely tied to task predicting performance. In that instructional core, then, we're focusing on what is the relationship between student, teacher, and content, and that's ultimately the task. But we must be focusing on those 3 elements within classrooms, and truthfully at all levels of our organization as well. My third action step is creating peer-to-peer teacher networks and teams. So we must identify master teachers. In this, I see them as essential in moving forward. I would like to pair novice teachers with master teachers. This, at some schools, is going to be difficult. We've had a lot of turnover. We have a lot of novice teachers, but I think it's a worthwhile investigation. Sometimes these master teachers have been there for 20 years, and we just need to have this conversation to better understand. They don't have to teach everything, but I think it's really important to isolate them within districts. I'd like to create teams, either interdepartment teams or intergrade teams, that are going to then be working on some of the next stuff that I'll talk about. We will be dedicating time within the schedule for our meetings. So we need to create time for these teacher teams to meet. If we do not do that, it won't happen, or will happen at the expense of other work. And then I want us to identify a framework that teachers can use to guide their peer-to-peer coaching. We could do the Danielson 4-domain framework. We could do Zaretta Hammond's Ready for Rigor framework. There's a lot of options out there. I would like the schools to, at least at a school level, to have some coherence around that so that everyone's using the same language. Novice teachers are learning the language of teaching. They're having those conversations with their peer coaches. And they're also having them with administrators. These are just the first steps that I see us taking toward potentially leading toward teacher leadership within schools, but I see that farther down the road. Initially, I think creating these peer-to-peer teacher networks is going to be essential. So much research supports that this leads to positive student outcomes in forms of standardized testing, and also lead to positive teacher workplaces. All of these things then lead to teacher retention, which is ultimately what we are hoping for. The next step is around developing targeted PD around brain science and bias. So I would focus our efforts on PD on culturally responsive teaching. I think a community read of Servetta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain would be fantastic. Gives very specific moves, teacher moves, that can immediately be enacted in the classroom and have immediate effects on instruction, especially around creating independent learners from dependent learners, which is a lot of our schools, to be honest. I want to focus on phonics in the reading curriculum. Do just an audit of an entire reading curriculum across the district to see what are we doing, what kind of texts are we using, what different curricula are we using in these spaces, and moving toward making sure that as a district we are shifting toward the use of phonics exclusively. If we need community reads for this, I'd recommend some articles by Emily Hanford. Really nicely talks about why this is essential, why it's helpful, why we need to work toward this, especially if we have potentially community members, parents maybe, but then maybe teachers who are initially resistant to this. We just need to have some conversations about why that matters. And lastly, I would recommend some PD on brain science. There's some great resources out there for this. A free resource is The Learning Scientist. So many great resources online that you can use entirely for free. But then if we do have discretionary funds in this area, we could call on the Teaching Lab, which is an organization that provides teacher-led PD on this specific focus. So some options. I'm not saying we have to do either of those in particular, but I think some kind of PD on this will be essential moving forward. I see myself as a CAO coaching principals for coherent focus on deeper learning. So this is where I would step in and say this is my immediate action step. I believe that we need instructional leadership at all levels, and I think we need to really work on understanding what this looks like. So for this, we need to provide coaching and support. And we need then a coherent focus on deeper learning for all, even at these levels. So it's not just deeper learning for students, it's for teachers through that peer-to-peer group work, through that PD with dedicated teamwork time. It's also for principals and leaders within the district. I see this as something that the superintendent would also be part of, that we're all, and I would be as well, that we're all working toward and in a deeper learning environment in IPS. We need to, when we're thinking about community partnerships, train our school employees on this. This is not something that teachers inherently understand how to do, that principals inherently understand how to access these, or even the district leadership. This is something that Karen Mapp talks about, that we need to actually train people how to be community partners. And ultimately, we also need to think about community as part of teaching and learning, not as a separate entity. And lastly, we also need to view them as co-producers and co-creators of an effective school system. And again, I'm taking some language there from Karen Mapp's work on this, which we could use as a resource for our district if we wanted to. We need to move away from them as a kind of deficit model of accountability toward a producer model, co-producer, co-creator with us in the work of teaching and learning. And lastly, we need to conduct budget audit to align finances with student outcomes. So this would be an immediate step in this, just to make sure there's coherence between our instructional vision and district finances. I would recommend perhaps calling on Dr. Lynn Johnson, who's working at Chicago Public Schools, done a lot of work with this. That would be fairly close to where we are, 3 hours away. Be a great resource for us to use as we move into this area. And we also need to think about equitable distribution of district funds. Thinking about Stacy Childress's work in Montgomery County, that these are resources that we could use, other school models, other district models, to make sure that we're doing a similar effective and equitable distribution of funds within IPS. That's a lot of information. I appreciate your time today. I realized that I went about 15 minutes over what I thought I was gonna do today in this presentation, but I have a lot of plans for IPS. I'm so excited to do this work with you. I'm looking forward to continuing to learn from you. And I'll begin that now with your questions and comments.